Welcome everyone. It's a delight to be here virtually, even though I couldn't be there in person. And my goal today is just to tell you a little bit about the work that I've been doing with some of Canada's rarest plants, mostly entirely in southern Ontario, which is a hot spot in Canada for rare plants. So according to the most recent wild species report, we have about just over 5,200 vascular plants in Canada, and about 690 of those are imperiled, critically imperiled, extirpated, or possibly extirpated. And we have only 42 plants that don't grow anywhere else except for in Canada, so they're endemic to Canada. And so what are we doing about helping these 690 imperiled species? Well, our sort of flagship policy for species at risk is, of course, the Species at Risk Act, which came into being back in 2002. And I really appreciate the preamble of the Species at Risk Act, which states that wildlife in all its forms has value in and of itself, in addition to being valued for all these other reasons, including spiritual, recreational, educational, historical, and ecological reasons. So we value wildlife for these reasons. And so we might wonder, okay, well, how do we define wildlife? And Species at Risk Act very obligingly does that too. So a wildlife species under our Species at Risk Act is a species, subspecies, variety, or even a genetically distinct population of animal, plant, or other organism, except for bacteria and viruses. And so what I like to point out is that this means that this caribou here is wildlife, but also this lovely little spotted wintergreen is wildlife. So I'm getting a little thing saying my internet connection is unstable. So just let me know if I disappear. So yeah, it's this green, our sort of green wildlife is the wildlife that I'm interested in and that I'll be talking about today. So basically I'm going to divide my talk into 2 parts, or 2.5 parts. I'll talk a little bit about using species distribution models to predict suitable habitat for rare woodland plants. This is work that I started during my first postdoc and continuing on with. So this is since 2014. And then secondly, some more recent work looking at the land tenure of plant species at risk in Canada and their representation in 2 of our flagship federal programs. So here's a bar graph showing the species listed under our Species at Risk Act, and you can see that plants are the largest group of species listed under this act. And I'm cheating a little bit here because I'm including bryophytes and lichens in this total, but even if we only look at vascular plants, we're up around close to 200 species. So one of the issues that we have with trying to figure out how to recover plant species at risk is that often we don't have sort of really good data that sometimes or often is available for other groups. So this is an example. Back in 2014, I think, I attended the Kosiwik assessment meeting in Ottawa, and one of the species that they assessed was the St. Lawrence beluga whale. And you can see they have this really compelling model. This is a population model based on recent observations and historical harvest records showing the decline in the population of these whales since 1920. So this is very compelling evidence of the status of the species and how much it has declined in the past 80 years. With plants, often we don't have that kind of really good data. And not only do we not have data on their population sizes, often we're not even sure how many populations we actually have. So this is an example. This is the broad beach fern, which is listed as special concern and grows in southern Ontario and Quebec. And so this is just a little excerpt from the data that the province of Ontario has. So they have a little note in their database saying, well, we think there's at least 40 occurrences, but probably it's closer to 50. They're not quite sure. Most of these populations are on private land, and many records are old, so no one has resurveyed them recently. And so this species probably has declined due to forest clearing. But there's so much uncertainty in terms of like, not only how many individuals of this species do we have, but how many populations do we actually have and where are they? And so this can lead to a lot of uncertainty in the status, as I've said, of these species. So this is an old paper from 2013 that Brett Favaro led, where they looked at all the species that had been assessed by COSEWIC, the Committee on the Status of Endangered Wildlife in Canada, more than once since 1977, sorry. So there's 116 plant species listed under the Species at Risk Act that have been assessed more than once by COSEWIC. And 15 of those improved in status. So most of them stayed the same, a few of them got worse, and 15 species improved. So this would be a situation where, for example, a species had been listed or had been assessed as endangered, and then it had improved to either maybe threatened or special concern, or maybe not at risk. But then when they dug deeper, they found out that 9 of those had improved, not really because they improved, but just because more botanists had been out looking for them, and so there was increased survey effort, and they found more populations that we hadn't known about. And this happens quite a lot with plant species that we think are extirpated from Canada, or from a province. So this is an atlas of rare vascular plants that was put together by Argus and colleagues from 82 to 87. And they listed 29 species of plants that were only known from records or herbarium collections prior to 1925 in Ontario. And so they assumed that those were extirpated. But since then, 9 of these have actually been rediscovered, so 31%. So on one hand, this gives us hope for things like species like this. This is one of my favorite species, the spring blue-eyed Mary. Even though I've never seen it, I really, really wanted to find it. It was last seen in southern Ontario in 1954, and so it's presumed extirpated, but it's possible that it's still out there. And we just haven't had a botanist or a biologist, someone who might notice it in the right place, in the right time to notice it. So the question is, how can we make more efficient our surveys? So if we don't have enough money or people to send botanists out looking for these things everywhere, is there a way that we can make surveys for these species more efficient? And one possibility is to use species distribution models. And I'm definitely not the first person who's tried to use these for targeting surveys for rare plants. This has been done a whole bunch of times in other places in the US and definitely in Europe. And researchers have had success with doing this. So the sort of really easy basics of how a species distribution model works is that you take the known occurrences where you know the species exists. So this map is just showing a small portion of the range of the green dragon here. That's this lovely plant on the left. So each of these green stars is a known occurrence of this plant all along the Maitland River here, which flows into Lake Huron. And so we put these occurrences into a computer model along with data on underlying environmental variables, so geospatial data on climate, topography, elevation, superficial geology is a big one for predicting plant habitat suitability. And the model spits out estimates of habitat suitability across the region. So all these little orange squares here, or red squares, are predicted to have suitable habitat for the green dragon. So what that means is, if we know we have these populations all along the Maitland River here, probably we should also be looking all along the Bayfield River down here. And sometimes these models basically give us what we would have gotten if we asked experts. Expert botanists would say, yeah, this thing likes riparian forests, and so if you're looking for it, you should look along rivers. But for some of these species, we don't, even the experts don't have a clear idea of how precisely to define suitable habitat. And so this can really help direct us where we should look. And so when I got going on this in 2014, what I wanted to know was, first of all, can we use SDMs to help find rare plants in Southern Ontario? But second of all, how much does landscape context matter? And by that, I mean sort of the conditions of the landscape surrounding the site. So many of the successful studies that have used SDMs to locate rare plants have occurred in national parks or sort of wide expanses of mostly intact habitat. Our rare plants in Southern Ontario mostly live on landscapes like this. So these are fragments of deciduous forest that have been left over after clearing for agriculture. And so I wanted to know, okay, does it matter, the size of these patches or the amount of forest in the overall landscape, how successful these SDMs might be? So when I started out in 2014, I started with a pilot with just 8 species. So these are the 8 that I chose. And what I did was I tried to vary them in terms of how many recorded records we have of them. So that's what these numbers are in the top right-hand corner. So this is the autumn coral root, which we only have 5 known occurrences of that, all the way up to eastern flowering dogwood, which has nearly 300 in the databases. And then also varying their status rank. So S1 means basically critically imperiled, so usually fewer than 10 occurrences, whereas S3 means usually less than 100 occurrences in the province of Ontario. And then I tried to vary the type of habitat that they prefer. So some of these are specialists, like the heartstongue fern here. It only grows on the sort of limestone bedrock of the Niagara escarpment, whereas flowering dogwood is quite a generalist. You can find it almost anywhere. And then most of these plants, as most of our plant species at risk in Canada are found in Ontario. They're at the very northern tip of their global range. So they range south well into the US, except for these 2. So the ram's head lady slipper here and the heartstongue fern both have the majority of their distribution in Southern Ontario. So I used a program called Maxent to build SDMs. This is a machine learning program. And the predictors that I used 14 of them. These ones to do with soil, geology, and topography, then 4 temperature-related variables, and 4 precipitation-related variables. And I used a grid cell size of 100 by 100 meters. So this is a 1 hectare area. And basically I decided on this sort of as a compromise between sort of the maximum size that I thought I could thoroughly search. So I didn't think I could thoroughly search more than a hectare of forest in a day. And then the resolution that was available for these environmental predictors. So once I built SDMs for these 8 pilot plants, then of course the next step was to actually go out to some of these places predicted to have suitable habitat and see if we could find the plant. So I did this with an intrepid crew of undergraduate students from the University of Guelph, and then moving on to Carleton University. And what we did is we created these sort of 1 8 by 10 page back and front fact sheets that we could show to landowners, because we focused our surveys on private land, because of course most of the forested land in Southern Ontario is private land, it's privately owned. And considering that likely those private sites have been less frequented by biologists than provincial or land trust owned sites. So it was really helpful to have these sheets so that when we're knocking on someone's door and saying, hey, can we go back into your back 40 over there and look for this plant, we could show them what we were looking for. And in some cases, we had landowners say, oh yeah, we've got tons of that stuff. You know, I've seen that all the time. I didn't know that was rare. So these were really useful. So we've now had 4 summers of these surveys, and we've visited 282 1-hectare forest sites. This is a map of where we've been. So you can see this research was highly not carbon neutral. There was unfortunately a lot of gas spent in getting to these places. But every day was kind of like an adventure. We never knew what we were going to find. And we visited some very, very beautiful forests, and we also visited some very junky forests. At the end of those 4 summers in total, we found 152 previously undocumented occurrences of provincially tracked plants. So not all of these are listed under any legislation like the Species at Risk Act, but they're all either S1, S2, or S3. So they have fewer than 80 known occurrences in the province of Ontario. These are just 3 examples of species that we encountered. We also found some species that we weren't looking for that were a bit surprising. So we had lots of fun doing these surveys. So in the pilot, the first thing that I wanted to know was basically just, does the habitat suitability as predicted by the model, is it, if the models are any good, we would expect that the habitat suitability should be higher in places where the species is present compared to where it is absent. So the data that I'm going to show you here is from just the first year of surveys. And then since we didn't have a lot of presences from our first year, we got some additional independent presence records from the province. So these were ones that were not used to build the original models. So it's important to note that these absences and presences are completely independent from the set of presences that I used to build the SDMs. So if I put the data in now, you can see just looking at these bars, these are the average for absence, places where the plant was absent and places where it was present. So you can see for most species, the predicted habitat suitability is on average higher for places where the plant was present. There's lots of variation though, except for, this is the broad beach fern here, which had a very poor species distribution model in which absences actually had on average higher predicted habitat suitability. So this was not a very useful SDM at all. But what you might notice is that I've divided these records into sites, so 100 by 100 meter sites that have more than 40 hectares of forest surrounding them. And the open circles are sites that have less than 40 hectares. So basically, this is what that looks like. So these squares in the middle, those are our survey sites. So this is a 100 by 100 meter square of forest. And then the dotted line is a 500 meter buffer surrounding that square. And so you can see how some sites have quite a lot of forest within that 500 meter sort of perimeter, and a lot of our sites didn't have much. So if this circle was totally full of forest, it would be about 80 hectares. So I've divided them into sites with more than 40 hectares and less than 40 hectares of forest. So when you look at those 2 types of sites separately, you can see that there's some interactions going on between the predictions of the SDM and what's on the surrounding landscape. So for example, these 2 species here, we actually had no independent presences in any cell that had less than 40 hectares of forest within that 500 meter buffer. But then these 2, we had this interaction whereby the prediction of the species distribution model was more effective if you were in a site with lots of forest. So for example, you can see these sites over here that did not have the plant, and yet they had very high, upwards of 80% habitat suitability. And you think, well, why the heck wasn't the plant here? Well, they all have in common that they have very low amount of forests surrounding them. And so this, causes me to wonder if this has something to do with the connectivity of the forest on the landscape, or the ability of these species to disperse to sort of suitable habitat on the landscape. And then poor old broad beech fern here had a bad model to start with, and the model was even worse if we only considered sites with very low amounts of forest. So this is old news. This pilot study was published in 2016. And since then, in collaboration with Joe Bennett at Carleton University and 2 of his graduate students, we've really expanded this project even bigger. So we now modeled about 40 different plant species. And this is Hannah Rosner-Katz, who finished her master's in 2018. And so what she did is she took species distribution models for about 30 species that we could validate as being useful. So we could show that you have a higher chance of finding this plant species in places that the model predicts has highly suitable habitat compared to places where it isn't. And then she built models relating the prediction of the species distribution model to the probability of occurrence of the plant. And then she overlaid those predictions for about 30 different species and created a map that looks like this. And so she called this an efficiency index. So a high efficiency index basically means there's a high probability of occurrence of multiple of these 30 species that we build models for. So what she did is she went out as part of our surveys and selected sites that had a high efficiency index. So these are these MSC, so they're suitable for multi-species. And she compared those. We didn't want to compare those to forest sites that were predicted not to be suitable for anything. So instead, we compared them to sites that were predicted to have suitable habitat for only one of those species. So we can kind of see, does it help with the efficiency of our surveys if we overlay these predictions? And here's what she found, which was pretty astounding. So in the orange, these are the 30 species that this overlay, these predictions are based on. And so you can see if you go to a site, a 1 hectare site that's suitable, predicted to have the occurrence of one of these species, you get about a 10% chance of finding one of those species. Whereas if you go to a multi-species hotspot, you have about 20% of those sites have one of those species that were modeled. So we're basically doubling our chances of finding something. But the cool thing is really that in addition to the species that were in the model, we also tended to find other tracked species, so other S1, S2, or S3 species in much higher frequency in these multi-species hotspots. So if you go to these multi-species hotspots, on average, about nearly 40% of those will have at least one of these tracked species. So we think this has a lot to do with kind of overlap in the niches of these species. They like mature deciduous forests, often in riparian areas. And so part of this is just seek and ye shall find. If you go out to a forest in Southern Ontario, you have a chance of finding a tracked rare plant. But we can really increase our chances of finding one of these plants if we can overlay these predictions of occurrence that we get from species distribution models. And this work is in press, hopefully coming out soon in biodiversity and conservation. And then Elise Ernest, who is another one of Joe Bennett's master students, she's just about to finish. And so Joe had this idea of, we have this uncertainty with how many populations of these species are actually out there. So if we know these SDMs are relatively good at predicting occurrence, could we use this to get an idea of how many populations of certain species are actually out there? So the idea was we could build an SDM, we could validate it with these independent presences and absences. Okay, so we have an independent accounting of how good this SDM is at predicting the occurrence of these species using our field surveys. So then we can use those to relate the habitat suitability as predicted by the SDM to the probability of occurrence, so we can predict that probability of occurrence across all the 1 hectare cells in Southern Ontario. And then could we just sum that probability for each cell across all the cells to estimate the likely number of extant populations? And so Elise, over the past 2 years, has been working on this with 6 of these rare plants that we have the best and the most independent survey data for. So for example, this is Lithospermum latifolium, American Gromwell. It's not listed, but it's an S3 species. So when we built the SDM here, AUC is a measure of the discrimination ability of the SDM. So basically the ability for the SDM to discriminate between true presences and absences. And that ranges from 0 to 1, where 1 is a very excellent, perfect model. So anything above about 0.7 is considered useful. This SDM had an AUC of 0.92, which is really, really good. During our surveys, we found 8 new occurrences of this plant, and we had 243 independent absences. We exclude any absences if we were not at the plot at the right time. So if we were at a site when the species may not have been visible, or it may have been too early or too late in the season, we don't include those. So if you use this SDM then to build a model of the probability of occurrence across the landscape, and then use various filters. So for example, Elise would exclude cells occurring in non-forested areas, because obviously we know if we're in a cornfield or if we're in a parking lot, we are not going to find American Gromwell. And we come up with an estimate of between 517 and 3,700 likely occurrences of this plant on the landscape. However, we only know of 22. So then we looked at this and we thought, well, is that even reasonable? I mean, to me, as someone who has spent a lot of time in forests, in the type of forest that this plant would like, and has only seen it 8 times, I highly doubt there really is 3,700 extant occurrences out there, but how can we actually tell? And so it was the kind of the brainchild of Joe that we should do some simulation tests to really see how many surveys do we need to have confidence in our estimates if we're using this method. And so that's what Elise has done. So she has created a synthetic landscape, but it's still Southern Ontario, and where the probability of the species being there is based on our species distribution model, which we know is quite accurate or quite useful. And so she simulated sort of true occurrences across the landscape at varying levels. So in the top panel here, she simulated 200 occurrences on the landscape, where the probability of selecting that 1 hectare cell as an occurrence varies with the suitability of the habitat as predicted by our model. And she did that over a range of different numbers. So for example, the top panel is for 200 occurrences, and the bottom panel here is for 1,600. And then she simulated sampling the landscape either with targeted surveys based on the SDM, so like we did, informed surveys where we based it on our SDM, or just random surveys where you would randomly select which 1 hectare cells to visit. So she's compared these, and you can see sort of the range of estimates of extant occurrences that come out of these. And so basically the main focus here is that for informed sampling, we sort of verge towards a more accurate estimate of the true number of occurrences on the landscape only after we survey about 1,000 1 hectare grid cells. So that's a lot of effort, right? So that seems a bit daunting. On the other hand, If you don't use the SDMs, if you just use random surveying, you don't sort of hone in on that true number of occurrences until you're up around more like 10,000 surveys. So this shows that our 282 surveys are not enough to really have an accurate idea of how many populations of these species are left on the landscape. But using the SDMs definitely reduces the amount of information we need to get closer to an accurate estimate. But from my point of view as a field botanist, I say, see, we still need to get out there. We need more people out there looking for these species. Okay, so out of all these places, as I said, that we visited, most of them are private land. And we noticed that 38% of the plots that we visited on private land had at least one provincially tracked plant. Only 28% of the plots on protected land, so this included places like Nature Conservancy of Canada property, provincial preserves, or sort of local land trusts. Only 28% of those had at least one provincially rare plant. So to me, this says, you know, it's really important to understand and to protect rare plants on private land. And going back to the Species at Risk Act, we have this clause that seems really strong at first. You know, no person shall kill, harm, harass, capture, or take an individual of a wildlife species that is extirpated, endangered, or threatened. So that seems really strong, but when you read further down, you notice that this is on federal land only. And so the question that we had, and I worked on this with a student that I worked with at Carleton, was what proportion of the known population of these plant species listed under SARA actually occur on federal land and therefore receive protection. Because if they're not on federal land, unless there's some provincial regulations that might protect them, they're not officially protected. And so what we did is we gathered up all the COSEWIC status reports for plants listed as extirpated, endangered, threatened, or special concern. And we looked in this habitat protection and ownership section. So each of these reports has a section that basically gives the best information available on the land tenure of where these populations are. So this is an example for the American Colombo. And if you read in this section, it says 2 of the extant populations occur in provincial parks. All of the remaining 11 populations are on private property with no existing protection. So we would record that as 0 populations on federal land, majority of known populations on private land. So when we looked at all 234 species, we found that only 9% have the majority of their known populations on federal land. So that means only 9% basically have the majority of their known populations protected under the law. 33% of those plant species have most of their populations on private land. And of course, we would expect this because we have this concentration of rare plants and plant species at risk in the south of our country, so southern Ontario, the southern Okanagan, southern BC, southern Nova Scotia, where the majority of the land is privately owned. In addition, if we just look at how many species have at least one of their populations on private land, 74% of these species have at least some of their known populations on private land. So this tells to me that, again, it's very important that we have focus on conserving these species on private land. And then the other thing that we wanted to know was how much are we actually spending to help plants compared to what we're spending on other taxonomic groups. And this is from a paper by Havens et al. In 2014, looking at US federal and state spending on endangered and threatened species. And you can see that the discrepancy between plants and animals is enormous. In the US, less than 5% of expenditures, at least up to 2012, I think this goes to, were spent on plants. And so we wondered, okay, is this also true in Canada? No one has really looked at this. Part of the reason no one's looked at this is that this data is a bit easier to compile in the US because they have to, states and the feds have to report on how much money they spend kind of to a centralized place. So they report how much they spend on recovery of different species, and we don't really have that here in Canada. But we thought we could look at two of the sort of flagship federal programs that directs money towards species at risk. So the first one of these is the Habitat Stewardship Program, or the HSP, which was established in 2000. So basically it provides funding for projects, either stewardship projects or research projects, that contribute to the recovery objectives in recovery strategies for species listed under the Act, and for others that maybe aren't listed yet. And so individuals or groups or NGOs can apply for these grants and use them to do actions that recover species at risk. The other big one is the Natural Areas Conservation Program, which is a collaboration with the Nature Conservancy of Canada. So the government of Canada invests millions of dollars, and then those are matched 2 to 1 with money from land trusts and donors. And the objective of this is to buy and protect land. So it's not about particular stewardship actions, it's about buying and protecting property. So me and Peter, my student, got hold of the 8th Annual Progress Report for the NACP, which reports on, okay, of all the land that we've bought using this money, how many species at risk are we protecting? So for example, this land protects 67% of SARA-listed reptiles. So there's documented occurrences of 67% of SARA-listed reptiles in these protected areas, but only 22% of SARA-listed plants are protected on these properties. Now, it's hard to really say why this is, if it has to do with how land is prioritized for protection, or if it has to do with sort of the regions in which this land was purchased. But for whatever reason, we're seeing lower representation of plants on these NACP properties. Now, the Habitat Stewardship Program, which is this project-based program, I was delighted to just ask Environment Canada, and they basically sent me a list of all the HSP projects between 2006 and 2019. We had the name of the project, the applicant's name, and the amount of money that they received. So the kicker was that that was the only thing we had, so they didn't sort of keep track of which taxonomic groups or which species were incorporated in each project. And so we had to rely on using the title of the project to determine which taxonomic groups were involved. So for some of these projects, it would be like, project to conserve multiple species at risk on southern Vancouver Island, right? I mean, that could include plants, animals, multiple things. But for a bunch of these projects, we were able to tell whether they were focused on, what species they were focused on and what taxonomic group. So here along the bottom, I have the year of the project, and across the side are the number of projects per SARA-listed species. So we're basically showing it as a proportion of the number of listed species. So here's the data. So you can see there's been quite a decline over time, but the big winners here are definitely not plants. So plants and arthropods are down here at the bottom in terms of the number of HSP projects that have been awarded as a proportion of the number of species. And then the reptiles, the fish here in the blue, the birds, and the mammals, those seem to be the greatest number of projects are going to those. This data looks pretty much the same if we look just at the number of projects, not dividing by the number of species. So early on, plants were getting awarded similar numbers of projects as mammals, fish, and birds. and reptiles, but this seems to have declined, especially in the past 5 years or so. So there's quite a discrepancy there. And then we were able to look at the total amount of money spent on these different projects. So the total spending for that amount of time was $161 million. The projects that we could tell for sure what taxon was involved was $69.5 million. Out of that $69.5 million, plant projects were allocated $8.3 million, which is about 12%. In contrast, things like mammals, so mammals, even though they're a much smaller proportion of listed species, received $17.5 million worth of HSP projects, which is about 25% of all that money for projects we could determine what species was involved. So why aren't there as many plant projects? Maybe it's a bias towards mammals, birds, and fish. There's this idea of plant blindness that's kind of been circulating in plant conservation circles about how people are sort of more in tune with charismatic mammals and birds and fish, and they pay less attention to plants. But we don't know whether there were fewer projects awarded of many that applied, or if there were just fewer plant project applicants. And one of the points that Matt Haven's paper made that sort of looked at this issue in the States was that they've seen a big decline in the number of students graduating with degrees in plant biology or botany. And there's been this loss of botany departments across universities. And so maybe we just don't have enough researchers putting in these projects. We can't tell that from our data, but our conclusion was that it would be good to prioritize plants, to sort of put a call out and say, listen, we need more work on stewardship of plants and other neglected taxonomic groups. So this work is in revision right now, and hopefully will come out soon in facets. So I'll just end up with some of my thoughts on the future of plant conservation in Canada, some of my opinions on what we should do more and how we can improve. And so the first thing is with assisted translocation or reintroduction. This is a paper that came out in 2018 that was an analysis of recovery documents by some people in the conservation department at the Calgary Zoo. And so they gathered together all the recovery documents, so including recovery strategies and COSUIC status reports, and they looked at which species had translocation or reintroduction either recommended as a potential recovery thing or as a definite recovery strategy that we should use. And as you can see here, vascular plants came out on top as the taxonomic group for which this action was not necessarily recommended, but thought of as some potential to protect or recover these species. So 107 plants have evidence of, yeah, we should maybe think about helping them to translocate to new locations or reintroducing them where they've been extirpated. They then looked at where they could see evidence of this having occurred. Now, I think this might be a slight underestimate because, again, they're only using these recovery documents, so there might be more work on plant translocations and reintroductions occurring that isn't in these documents. But here, whereas they showed up at the top, vascular plants, for having this as a, something we should look into or at least think about, they found only 16 plant species had evidence of assisted translocations occurring as a recovery strategy. So they're near the bottom in terms of how often this has been done. One of the species I've worked with in Southern Ontario is the wood poppy, which is endangered. It's this beautiful forest spring blooming flower, bright yellow flowers. It has these tiny little seeds. Well, I guess they could be tinier. With this little elaiosome. So the elaiosome is an oily body that has a lot of nutrition in it and which is very attractive to ants. So this plant is considered to be ant dispersed. We have only 5 known populations of this plant, all in southern Ontario. And they grow in landscapes like this, right? So we have patches, remaining patches of Carolinian forest. And so if this patch over here goes extinct for whatever reason, for just chance, because it's a small population, because of some catastrophe, because the landowner didn't realize that was a rare plant and stacked his wood there one year, it's very unlikely, from my perspective, that this patch would be able to be recolonized, given that it's separated by all these fields. So I really think we have to start thinking about assisted translocation, not just in the sense of losing a population, but to establish more populations in suitable habitats so that we don't have all our eggs in one basket, so to speak. If we only have 5 populations and we lose one, that's a huge deal. But if we can establish self-sustaining populations, maybe get it up to 10 or 15, then we have a much greater chance of actually recovering this thing, of not just watching it sort of disappear, just watching these 5 populations and hoping that they, stay around. But in Canada, we've been very hesitant to use this as a recovery strategy, and I completely see why. Assisted translocation hasn't really picked up. Although it's a bit surprising because this is used a lot, or at least attempted a lot, in places like Australia and in the United States. But so if we look back, the Canadian Botanical Association put out this statement back in the 90s. The Canadian Botanical Association is strongly opposed to the idea that transplanting is a reliable method of conserving rare species. And that relates to this idea expressed here in the book about restoring Garry Oak ecosystems, that we don't want to sort of give this impression that, oh yeah, it's okay if we take out this population to have a gravel pit or to do a development, because we can just replant it somewhere else. And that's definitely not what I'm saying. So I agree that translocations should never come before the protection and management of plants in situ, and it should not be viewed as a solution to their destruction at a site. To me, what it more is using this as a tool to sort of augment the number of populations so that we have a little insurance against unforeseen destruction or decline of these known populations. The other thing I think that we need more of, and that's to do with knowing how many of these plants are dependent on private land, is to have more programs to promote plant conservation on private land. So this is a picture of a landowner. It's a member of one of these landowners associations that are very against regulations of what they can and cannot do on their property. And so I think what we need are more programs like this. This is Rare Plant Rescue that has been run by Nature Saskatchewan for about 18 years now. They've received some money from the Habitat Stewardship Program in the past. And their goal is to build strong, respectful relationships with landowners. Okay, so it's not about necessarily showing up and telling someone what to do. It's showing up and saying, hey, did you know that you might have this plant that hardly grows anywhere else in Canada, and we'd be happy to help you learn how best to steward this. And it's worked very well for them. Unfortunately, we do not have a program like this in Southern Ontario, which, as we know, is a hotspot of rare plants in Canada. We used to have programs like this, for example, the Natural Heritage League, which was about landowner contact to work with landowners who have species at risk and other unique ecological characteristics. This, in my opinion, was very effective, but died in 1992 due to a lack of funding. Then we had the Ontario Stewardship Network, which was kind of a similar idea of the province providing some money for an advisor and bringing together members of the community and volunteers to think about what sort of conservation actions they could do on private land and helping people access different programs. This died again in 2013 because of lack of government funding. Some of these stewardship networks, though, are maintaining their activities with funding from other sources. So just to sum up, I really think we need to do some more research on using assisted translocation as a potential tool to recover, to truly recover, not recovery, the rarest plant species at risk. I think it would be great if we could somehow promote equalization of plant representation in these federal programs. I don't think we can say that that the federal government has some kind of bias or anything like that. But if we could promote more representation for plants, we could get more of these projects done. And then have more programs like Rare Plant Rescue to work with private landowners to educate them and to help them steward these plants. About 99% of the landowners I worked with in Southern Ontario were more than happy to have us on their property, and many of them were delighted when we told them that they had a rare plant growing in their forest. So I'll just wrap up by reiterating that plants are indeed part of Canada's wildlife, and they're worth protecting and appreciating. And thank you all for coming to this virtual talk. I'm sorry that I can't meet you in person, but I hope I will eventually, and I'm happy to take any questions that you might have.